Next week, we will have Jesse Jenkins, who just recently graduated from MIT, and he's now a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he's done a lot of modeling about the electric grid and what it takes to go low carbon or deep decarbonization. So he's going to give us a talk on what he's been working on. It's entitled Getting to Zero, what it will take to decarbonize electricity, and will the Green New Deal help? So if we want to see what's being discussed in the news and somebody has some relevant analysis, next week will be a great talk for that. This week, it is we three gentlemen up here having a discussion for today's Valentine's Day talk. So we thought we'd have a cute title here for the love of energy, how and why we talk past each other regarding our energy future. So today is meant to be a little bit of a conversation about a lot of topics we've had here at the Energy Symposium, but conversation amongst ourselves, and then if you have something you might want to chime in about or contribute in a short question or comment, then raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone along as normal. So for general introductory purposes, again, I'm Carey King, a research scientist and assistant director of the Energy Institute, and study how the energy system interacts with the economy in various ways. And I'll let the other two gentlemen introduce themselves roughly for you. So, David, you first.
I'm David Spence. I'm a professor of energy law at the law school primarily, and I also have an appointment in the business school. My research and teaching relates to the sort of legal and political institutional environment of energy regulation, so I'm a regulatory guy. And it's nice to see several of my students and ex-students here.
I'm like Carey King, Dr. Fred Beach. I work at the Energy Institute as well. I teach in the LBJ school, the engineering school, and the business school. I'm the resident energy technology geek, I guess. I like the technology and the policy. But what really fascinates me is geopolitics, why countries do what they do to one another with regards to energy, or looking at geopolitics through an energy lens.
So we'll go through a set of posed questions here to spur our own discussion, and then perhaps provoke some questions for yourself, and we'll go for the typical hour or a little bit longer of the symposium. So in the theme of Valentine's Day, some of you may be getting little candies that say, "Will you be mine?" on it with a little heart. To phrase this in terms a little bit of the energy system, we can say, well, will you be my reliable generator? There's a lot of discussion about what types of electricity generation should occur and whether it's reliable or not. This word reliable is thrown out a lot, and so we can think about, well, is this a good word, and what do people mean when they use this word, and do they use this word in different ways? And I would say, of course, they do. Reliability might depend on many things, and reliability in the context of running the electric grid relies on how long do you want to be reliable? What does reliability mean? Are you talking about reliability on very short time scales, shorter than even a person could make a decision, shorter than even some mechanical or electrical systems could even make a decision? But on the shortest time scale, we can think about things that happen faster than anything in the market, relays, electronics. Medium time scales, we can think about things where people can make decisions that affect outcomes or affect how generators are online. These might generically be called market interventions. They could be demand response. They could be telling which generator to turn on and which generator to turn off. But the time scales are too short to build something new. You're basically dealing with whatever exists out there. What are the capabilities of the electric grid right now? And so those would be generally this medium time scale, which can run from somewhat seconds to years or certainly months. And then you have the very long time scale, which is associated with planning the grid. What type of generator should you build? And it will last for many decades usually. What type of infrastructure, transmission lines, distribution lines, these kinds of things. So a lot of the talking past each other, if you will, might be, and a lot of times is, people talking about different ends of the spectrum and acting like their end of the spectrum is more important than the other, or if they're just trying to make an argument for one type of generator, they might just think about one time scale because that's the strongest piece of their argument. So given that's the way I like to think about this, I'll open it up to either the other two gentlemen. If you have some thoughts on this topic or examples of people doing this that you think is a good example of people discussing this, or a bad example of people discussing this, or how we should discuss this idea of reliability.
In my world, I think I think the point you make is exactly apt. There's a lot of people on the policy side who don't necessarily even make these distinctions or aren't aware of the differences in the capabilities of different generators over these different time scales. And it's probably fair to say that a lot of the sort of traditional utility people undersell the ability of renewables to be able to handle some of these things, right? On the shorter time scales anyway, and because they just haven't had to do it before, but it's, from what I understand, possible to serve some of these needs. But the people who are sort of promoting renewables, who see we're really motivated by the urgent need to clean up the generation mix, which is an urgent need that I feel as well, I think sometimes lack an appreciation for some of the reliability problems that might arise, perhaps rarely, but arise nevertheless in a all renewables or a very high penetration renewables future. So I think we do talk past each other in the policy world for the exact reason that you just described.
Good, thanks for making me seem smart.
I agree. My perspective on the reliability is we've been spoiled for a long time. It's become accepted that reliable with the grid means 99.99949s or 59s reliability, but that level of reliability has always had embedded in it a cost that we've just accepted. As we try to go to deeper, lower emissions, deeper decarbonization, one way to do that is change our expectation of where reliability is, because we don't seem to want to pay anymore. As soon as we start talking about I can give you lower emissions or lower carbon, but it maybe costs a little bit more, people seem to push back. Well, the other part of that balloon you can squeeze on or release is the reliability side. I mean, if the power were to go off at my house right now, I really don't care, right? I'm not there. Or even if I am there and it's going to go off for 15 minutes, and I know it's going to go off for 15 minutes, and I can accommodate that, but it reduces the emissions of the system as a whole, I'm perfectly willing to accept that. But as soon as you get into the discussion on the political side, and somebody even floats that idea of rolling brownouts or scheduled rolling, load loss to make the system less expensive or more, lower carbon, you just get the utility, oh no, my phone will start ringing off the hook, and it was at Energy Week last week, one of the speakers said that very thing. The last time there was a rolling brownout a few years back, the phones just ring off the hook. It's unacceptable. So I think redefining internally what we mean by reliability and what we're willing to accept or what we actually really need from a reliability perspective versus cost and emissions is something that needs to be reopened. So when we say reliable, you're thinking something, I'm thinking something, everybody else is thinking something else. So we are talking past one another about what we mean by reliability and what is acceptable.
Probably a time scale to those outages as well.
Exactly.
Right? So if it was 3 days instead of 30 minutes.
But even the 4 o'clock on an August afternoon, if I'm at home, the sun's up, I don't need my lights on, and even if I'm watching, I don't watch TV, but it's what is really important for a 15, 20, 30-minute time period, and if we're willing to accept that, especially in a planned manner where it's coming, what's the big deal? It's just a paradigm shift, because we've been so in tune to and so spoiled by, in my terms, 99.999, and that's the expectation, and nothing less is to be accepted.
So you sort of bring up, I guess, reliability for who, right? Reliability for you as a residential customer is
right.
Maybe a different concern than reliability for an industrial customer who doesn't want even 1 second. I think
but those customers have already put in the money because they have to, because they need more than 99.999. Yeah. They need another 9, so the chip fab, they've already put in the backup generation. The hospital's already put in the systems to accommodate that 5th or 6th 9, in most cases.
Right, so that maybe they can accommodate from some fairly short time scale, and then the question of cost, how much are they going to ensure reliability or continuity of their operation for 30 minutes, an hour, a day, these kinds of things. If the grid goes down for more than a day, then these start to stress all these kinds of limits.
So Fred's, your point was short period of time, if you know it's coming, no big deal, and you can plan for that. I think you get into, when you relax either of those conditions, it gets a lot more anxiety producing. I was in San Francisco during the random brownouts during the California electricity crisis, people were really unhappy about that, even though they were relatively short, but you didn't know when they were coming. So if you worked in the Embarcadero, you were not going to get in the elevator, even if you worked on the 44th floor. And if you're in the, more close to home, if you're in the polar vortex living in New England or something, then you'd like to know. You'd like to know ahead of time. You certainly don't want it to be a day or 2 days or 3 days. I don't know how many have seen this Bill Gates video going around from just this week where he was talking about an all renewables grid and the fact that there are cyclones in Tokyo every year, during which he claimed an all renewables grid would not be able to provide enough power for the city of Tokyo, and they last about 3 days, and they're every year, right? So what do you do for those 3 days? What's your backup? So I think it's a multidimensional problem, and we have to define our terms, really carefully when we talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess one other extension on that, the will you be my reliable generator? How about if I'm on my own reliable generator?
Right.
And then perhaps my standard reliability will change because I will personally bear the burden of whether I want 99 or 99.99 or 0.99, because now that full cost of that level of reliability is based on me. I think you'll see people taking a lot lower level of reliability or predictability or controllability, get all the illities in there. Affordability, now as an individual, you're managing all those personally and internalizing them and making your decisions based on that.
I think you have given a good segue into my next question, so I'll go there, which is, this again with the Valentine's Day theme. Honey, I love you, but you're not sending me all the signals I need. What do you want? I can't tell. Or if we were to rephrase this in an energy standpoint, honey, I need you to make another market signal or a new price, right? Give me another signal.
It's getting into a weird area.
Oh, so, well,
Yeah.
It's okay.
We are filming this, right?
So
I would love price signals. Please send me price signals. The flat rate, 11 cents a kilowatt hour, irrespective of anything, I think in this day and age with IT information the way we have it is ludicrous. Now, would many people respond to those price signals? I mean, there's studies that have been done that there's initial response, then over time it peters out. But still, why not? Send me price signals, please. Let me respond, if I choose to price signals.
Right, so I guess the question is how far, maybe or maybe not the 3-day typhoon example or something like this, the rolling brownout is kind of a club. You can't just, there's a lot of things you might not need in the case of emergency to operate from electricity, but there's a lot of things you do want to operate, and let's just say can you actually specifically turn off the correct half of loads that you want, and of course you need a signal to do that.
On
You need the
smart
ability
meters,
to
you
do
can.
that. Well, you need the ability to trigger individual devices, right? Or to some degree, or individual loads. Residential might be low on the totem pole compared to things like hospitals and grocery stores and things like this that might plan for these kinds of signals. So I guess we're sort of, in general, trying to move there with more signals and Internet of Things and making another markets, but this is a complication for policy.
Yeah, I think one of the big sort of mysteries over the last 5, 6, 7 years has been why we don't see more tariffs that have dynamic pricing at the retail level, given that we have smart meters penetrating about 50% of households nationwide, but very, very few companies offering these kind of real-time, price differential tariffs. And there have been a lot of pilot programs indicating that these things can work, that people will shift their load and reduce their demand during peak periods and save money doing it. There's a debate over whether or not the people that enroll in those pilot programs are a representative sample of ratepayers. They might be the equivalent of the people that line up overnight to buy the next iPhone. They might be sort of early adopters or sort of gadget-friendly people. But nevertheless, I sort of assume or I infer that maybe the utilities don't believe that people are going to sign up for these things, or maybe the stakes are too low. Maybe it's too much effort to save a few bucks each month on your bill. I don't really know the answer. It's kind of a mystery. And then you have the other side of the coin, which are these other ways of trying to get people to reduce demand, what we would call behavioral signals, just sending people information. You're using more than your neighbor. You have the same size house. You have the same. Those behavioral signals sometimes apparently work too, but they suffer from the same durability question that Fred raised. And so it seems like there's gains to be had on the behind the meter side of things, especially during peaks and in peak shaving. But we just don't seem to be seeing that much in the way of tariffs structured to try and get people to take advantage of that, which is kind of a quizzical thing.
There's potential that we are, in some sense, trying to set ourselves up to be ready for something that's maybe a more difficult situation. So some people, there's a question in general about whether you should have more markets or less markets and what things are included in markets. Obviously, externality costs, many of them are not included in markets. Carbon pricing being the one that people talk a lot about. But since we don't have a extremely high penetration of renewable energy yet, the price signals are, at least in wholesale markets, say relatively normal based upon variable generation costs of dispatchable generators like natural gas powered plants. And a lot of people want it, but there's a lot of things that aren't included in markets already that are heavily influencing them that people like to discuss, like subsidies or something. David, you and I were involved in a study with a group of people across campus looking at subsidies related to the electricity generation system at the federal level, as well as comparing California and Texas. And there's a lot of discussion, including an article that I just read today comparing Australia and Texas, and they're doing rolling brownouts in Australia and Victoria. And often this gets blamed for, you've broken my market, right? With these quote unquote out of market distortions, if you will, which are subsidies, but these are on the long range planning kinds of things, right? This is the time scale problem, right? You want the market to work at this medium time scale, and someone has done this long-term planning policy to incentivize generation for long-term planning or long-term goal purposes. So I don't know, I'll throw out the question. I expand my own opinions on the usefulness of doing the work that we did on the sort of comparing subsidies on a total dollar basis and a dollar megawatt hour basis, comparing technologies, which is, I'm not sure how useful that comparison is actually in the long run. To get the total dollar number of subsidies spent, I think is kind of useful on the grand scheme of the economy. I'm not sure how useful it is to pit one type of generation versus another, because we're sort of all people and we all use the grid, at least currently. But if we make more markets, maybe we'll start separating who's using what grid, right? We haven't totally gone there yet. Mm-hmm. I know you've thought a lot about this in terms of different types of markets down to the distribution level, even what implications might be.
So when we went to competitive markets in, 20 states or less, and at the wholesale level in the United States, the late 1990s, there was a lot of optimism about markets introducing efficiency into the system, and they probably have reduced costs of generation and transmission. That's not the same thing as saying that the markets can price everything that we care about in the system, right? And so there are attributes of the system that people want, particularly when it comes to clean energy, but also perhaps even in terms of reliability, that are difficult to price, at least on an individual level, because it's a collectively provided good. And then you also have this problem that energy markets price according to the marginal cost of a LASI unit devoted to the provision of the service, and that number has been going down, 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 and it looks like the logical extension of that is that eventually we'll have prices that are below the average costs of operating the system. So that's a feature of electricity markets, particularly as renewables penetrate more heavily, that makes just relying on price, which is sort of what a market is supposed to be. A market's supposed to let the price signal tell you when to invest in a new plant, when to reduce your demand, and all those sorts of things. Price alone might not be enough to provide us with a reliable system as that transformation happens. And so obviously here in Texas, we're all worried about that because we're now down to about an estimated 7.5% reserve margin from the target of 13, whatever it was, 13 3/4 that it used to be. Maybe the demand side things will help us make that margin. Maybe that margin is not the real margin because people will reduce their demand when the price goes up. So, but in any case, much of the rest of the world is experimenting with ways of trying to make sure we pay for the capacity that we think we're going to need, which itself is sort of a can of worms policy-wise. That is what FERC and Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and state PUCs and lots of other people are wrestling with. Can you wrestle with a can of worms? I'm mixing my metaphors. But anyway, it's tough. It's kind of a mess when you try to sort of take a textbook market, which is a clean, conceptually neat thing, and impose it on the electricity sector. It raises all kinds of difficulties. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it, but it certainly isn't a neat transposition.
I agree. I mean, you look at the market in ERCOT as an example today. If you try to teach that market in 1 hour to a class, you just can't, because the further you peel it back, the more complexity you realize there is in that market as we've added more elements, more marketability aspects of it over time. And the trend seems to be we want to add more. I would like personally to see more things priced or valued in that market structure to achieve some of the things we've just talked about, to make sure we do have enough capacity. You know, we already, to some degree, put a price on dispatchability. We also, to some degree, put a price on reliability. We don't currently put a value or a price on carbon emissions or emissions in general of it. If we were to do that, you know, if I were king for a day, boom, nukes, give them some kind of credit for being zero emissions. That's just my perspective. But as an example of things we value that we don't necessarily price in these markets, and therefore the market doesn't respond to it if we don't value it and put a price on it. But as complex as the market already is, even in just an ERCOT, every time we add another lever into that market for another element we want to value and see priced, then you can start to get unintended consequences perhaps as that ripples through the rest of the levers that are already in the market.
Right, they're not in the energy price, but we're creating other products that,
Right.
that are then priced, and that sometimes the interaction between them gets messy.
The feedback response can be interesting.
Yeah, add another market. So I kind of like what you said there, David. Effectively, markets are sort of a feature and not a bug in terms of price not necessarily covering the average cost of the generation, right? And the sort of Tex-Mex market is set up that way. So why would we be surprised when all the people who own generation don't get all the money they need to cover their fixed and operating costs? It's a feature, it's not a bug. So we add other kinds of markets on top of that. Aaron, can we get the mic for some questions? Yeah, we can do a question anytime. Go up here. Yeah.
Except for you.
Yep. Yeah.
How much of this is just the fact that we as people like carrots and not sticks, right? So we have, you know, subsidies as carrots. We can put prices on things, but those are sticks for some folks. And so instead of doing that to quote unquote, moving towards the future we want to go to, we put out these carrots, aka these subsidies. Is there's some human element to that that you for the reason we do it that way?
There's a resident human on the panel up here. But yeah, markets are an interesting way to make it not human, I guess, in some sense. It was the market's problem. It's not. It wasn't me. It was, you know, it's the market.
All the polling data. Yeah, I mean, you've probably seen it. The polling data show that people really, you know, want to address climate change and want to address carbon emissions, but when you talk about taxing it, the level of support goes down. You know, so I think you're right that historically taxes have been, especially in this country, much more difficult to galvanize or muster support for, enough support for to make them real. We might sneak them in there here and there. The New York Independent System Operator is looking at pricing carbon in its power market. We're adding a carbon adder to the price in the power market. They're calling it a carbon adder. You know, so the word
Not
tax,
a carbon subtractor. It's supposed to be
Right.
subtracting carbon. This is a carbon adder. Yeah,
But
maybe
they're
different.
not calling it a tax is what I'm getting at. So I think your question is, yeah, great point. It's absolutely true. We like carrots better than sticks.
Right, want to go over there?
Like for somebody to speak to the question of how to keep the grid synchronous, if that's what we want, as we replace synchronous generators with asynchronous renewables?
Anybody want to take that one first?
My simple answer is I think we should be moving away from an AC grid. Personally, now that's a long-term solution, but as I look at more and more, well, everything's money. I mean, we were either going to spend money to maintain what we currently have, spend money to upgrade what we currently have, or over time we can start transitioning away. And I say that as a big picture, more and more of what we buy are DC devices. An electric car is a DC device. Most of the components we put in our homes today come with that little brick you got to plug in the wall because they're DC devices, but we've been burdened ourselves with 100 years worth of building an AC grid. Now, we can certainly accommodate DC generation devices and DC loads on an AC grid. We're doing it now, and we're doing it more and more all the time. At what point do we finally say, why are we continuing the insanity? We've got DC generation, which is growing. We've got DC load, which is growing. Let's start evolving to a DC grid. Now, that's easier said than done, but if you never start, you never will. So the question is, should we move in that direction? Now, that's kind of a holistic look at it, but in direct answer to your question, sure. Inverters, rectifiers, I mean, we can keep it synchronized if we want to keep it as an AC grid. But it, again, comes with cost and losses.
Yeah, at the moment, I think I seem to believe the costs and losses associated with maintaining an AC grid are probably not so large to have a huge incentive to move away from it at the moment, given the gains in power electronics. And if we want to do DC transmission across long distances, then that's just sort of a cost question we can make on that, and maybe that'll come forward. But the inverters and integrating at least the large-scale utility wind and solar seems doable.
Buy stock in copper.
Yeah.
I'm not as qualified to answer this question as those guys are, but what Fred said sounded revolutionary to me. It sounded like War of the Currents 2 to me.
Right.
But I wouldn't challenge you on any of it. I mean, there have been lots of proposals for HVDC lines,
That's addressing a different type of issue, but yeah.
but it's long distance direct current transmission, but then that gets integrated into
Still
the AC
gonna-
grid, right?
still gonna rectify it.
So, yeah.
Perhaps from a reliability or resilience standpoint of individual homes and businesses or facilities, then I guess that's a question of, whether you can operate those DC or start building some DC that might improve that kind of
I mean, we
reliability.
can't start with a clean sheet of paper, but if you were building a brand new home, starting with a clean sheet of paper, and wanted to put solar on it as an example, and are going to own an electric car, that clean sheet of paper, you would be more logically and cost effective to go DC with that building. Now, it would actually cost you more because try to find somebody who's going to build that for you, they're going to give you an up price to do it, but inherently, physically, electrically, it would make more sense to go DC at that point. Disconnected from the grid.
I did want to make one comment.
The
Right.
current ones,
Yeah, yeah.
but not inherently physically is it necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm just going with the assumption that if you use an HVDC line now, it's not because you want to deliver DC, it's because you want to efficiently transmit over a long distance, and that can be a way to do it, and you're going to convert it back to AC anyway. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to maybe go back to market signal and prices a little bit. I know we said that flat rates are pretty ludicrous and that we should switch to maybe like a time of use rate type structure. What ability do reps have to sort of dispatch their loads to maybe incentivize them to participate in a time of use thing? Because in a low price market, there's not a lot of incentive for reps to have an active or dynamic load profile. The best you can do is try and circumvent coincident peak transmission charges.
I think these two guys live in Austin,
I live in Austin.
so you don't have a choice. I lived in Georgetown, so I didn't have a choice. I just recently moved outside the Georgetown city limits and had to sign up with a rep. And when you go to Power to Choose, that website that's supposed to be so wonderful, there are a million choices. And they're unbelievably confusing as each choice offers you 10 different plans. And being a geek, I sat down and worked through it all. There is no such thing as free nights and weekends on any of the plans, even though they call it that. They basically look at your rate, your usage over a period of a month, and they say, okay, so 2 of those days, I take out that percentage, we're going to charge you more, but we'll deduct that amount. I assumed they were actually watching my meter and giving me free. No. There is no such thing in the current market out there in the place to choose. So I was unable to find somebody that was actually going to give me a variable rate based on my usage, because I was just going to do everything on the weekend. But it doesn't work that way.
I think your point's well taken. The only ones I know about are up in traditional investor-owned utility territories like ComEd in Chicago, and they're getting a little bit of uptake, I understand, on dynamic retail rates there. But I don't know of many others. Do you?
It's rare.
If they're able to gather all of the benefits from that rather than changing the
Right.
retail provider next month
It
or next
reduces
year,
their
right?
costs
So you
in
end
the
up,
future,
this gets up. It's a great question if the market or wholesale prices are low and typically don't fluctuate much except for extreme events and high price spikes, then what are you really changing? So it seems like, I think, the value of demand response, and perhaps, I don't know if it'll be called market-based rates or price-based signal rates, will be on determining things like, you have signed up for a program, and if the grid is having some stability problem, you're signing up to be first to get cut off or second to get cut off or something like this. More so than adjusting to the
Get
prices.
compensated for that.
Yeah, you're just going to be slightly compensated. You get a little bit lower average bill, but when the grid needs some help, you're going to be the one we turn to. And quantifying that for the grid operator is a big part of the discussion here.
But it ought to be
Texas.
doable, right? I mean, I have apps from a bunch of different ISOs on my phone that tell me the price in real time, not ERCOT, by the way, but they don't have one. But that ought to be translatable through to a smart meter at a home or at a business. And I'm sure it is at some businesses, but it's a good question.
This is kind of a who gets to get the benefits, or what entity, what business entity. This gets into a lot of similar people arguing against renewables or fossil fuels, or who gets a subsidy or not, is which company gets to take advantage of demand response or storage or whatever types of new hardware or software can be employed, which maybe takes me slightly to my our next slide. It's not you, it's me. We're now going into the argument phase of the presentation. Or if we were to phrase this in terms of Valentine's Day or energy systems, breaking up is hard to do, which means breaking up monopoly or regulated utilities, in case you were wondering. So we kind of just introduced at least that concept of maybe some things are easier in regulated or monopoly utilities. Austin, for example, can take advantage of energy efficiency in homes and demand response in homes because it's responsible as an entity itself for its peak demand and how it integrates within ERCOT. So it can sort of take in all potential benefits of things like demand response or local storage or local generation. Maybe like your ComEd example, David, if they're still a regulated utility to some degree and they want to implement a program, well, they know they're going to be the ones to benefit from that infrastructure investment rather than some other company later. So I don't know, either how do we see this in the policy realm or difficulties?
I have something to say, but I think he's had something to say.
What
I say?
He's just thinking you have something.
Inhaled. I thought you were ready to talk, so I didn't want to.
Again, I'm too much of an engineer and a physicist and a truist. The fact that we've entered into a social contract in America with the grid for 100 years, how do you leave that social contract without completely destroying that contract? And that's what we talk about when we talk about grid defection and utility death spirals, is people making the conscious decision to invest the money to leave the grid, to leave that social contract. And that is when we talk about restructuring utilities or getting away from regulated monopolistic to more market-based. I mean, that theoretically is what you're doing, especially if you're talking about total grid defection as far as cutting the wire. It comes with all kinds of social implications if you do that, because those who can afford to do it would be the first to do it. Those who could least afford to do it will be the last to do it, and they will bear the burden of the additional cost as those who can't afford to do it leave, and now they're carrying the fuller burden of what's left of the socialized grid. Socialism is not a bad word, it's not an evil word. In a capitalist country like the United States, we have a lot of social institutions in the United States, the grid being one of them. But kind of back to your AC/DC question, if you never start the process to change, assuming you should, you're never going to change. So is there a path within the U.S. in our currently socialized grid structure to start moving to a disaggregated, desocialized type of grid? Some would say, well, never. Well, never say never. Probably not in my lifetime, but over a 50, 60, 80, 100-year time span, I think it's going to happen personally as we get more distributed generation, as we get more renewables into the grid, as we get more self-generation, as technology continues to improve and prices continue to come down on storage and generation. I don't see why 50 years from now, new construction homes aren't standalone power plants to where they do not need the grid and that it is affordable. But again, if we never start into that direction, we will never go there, as in breaking that social compact. But currently, that's the world we live in. We have all bought into that social compact, whether we realize it or not.
Well, let's set David up here. It's a question.
I was hoping this would spur
we've
David.
discussed. He's got a lot to say, but I'm going to see if he'll address a couple of concepts we've discussed in the past.
Now, that's the technologist's perspective.
Yeah, so is technology, an economist might just say capital, trying to create more capabilities, and is that just by definition how we employ and make markets, trying to split up the social contract, right? Is that an inevitable outcome, or is that an outcome that effectively these markets are trying to do? The more technology and the more markets, the more we can split up the social contract, and is that a good thing? I'm posing that as probably the case,
yeah.
and I know you've thought
That's a
a lot
really,
about
really
this.
big question, bigger than what I was going to say.
Okay, well, you can go with a small
But
question
let me just
first.
respond to a couple things Fred said. I think the exiting the system, part of the reason we have seen a lot of grid exit or sort of faux grid exit in the form of taking less electricity but still relying on the grid for backup, is because of the incentives people have to do that. And we pay a higher rate for rooftop solar than we pay for utility scale solar. Some of the reason for that is defensible and some of it's not.
Right.
A lot of net metering or value of solar tariffs have a social or environmental cost component to it that is not part of the compensation we pay to utility scale solar, but we pay it for rooftop solar. And so, and as you said, these are relatively well-off people taking advantage of that higher rate and finding it, worth their while to buy a lot less or net zero from the grid, which causes a problem for the rest of the grid. I think there are parts of a very high renewables or all renewables future that are easier in a traditional regulated monopoly system than in a market. In the future, utility scale wind and solar is going to be curtailed a lot, right? You're going to have lots of extra wind and solar to provide the service or to charge batteries or whatever it is you need when they're not, however you're going to provide it when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. It's cheap now because it's never curtailed or almost never curtailed. It knows it's going to sell power whenever the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. In a really high penetration grid, it's going to be a lot more expensive. And in a utility system, and there was this experiment done not long ago at Florida Power and Light on this, if it's one owner or one person sort of controlling the whole system, it's easier to manage that, and it's easier to get that built in the first place if you're in a traditional monopoly environment. And I'm not saying that's better. I'm just saying that there's a lot of these kind of trade-offs that we haven't necessarily thought through in the charge forward toward either decentralization or greening, and that need to be thought through before we can really make sure we're doing it in the best way.
I guess the only pushback I would give on that is most of those decisions and calculations and trade-offs you talk about are usually based on today's technology, today's cost, because that's all we know for certain is what it costs today, what the technology is capable of today. I can pretty much guarantee tomorrow that technology will be better and the cost will be lower. Now what the rate of that decline on the cost and the improvement on the technology is, we'll see as we go, but it could get to the point within 10, 15, 20 years, it isn't perhaps better to do it in a monopolistic grid. But using your assumption, that's what we're going to go build, because today that is perhaps the right answer. Well, if we go build that today, that's what we're going to have 10 years from now.
True.
And now it's more things that we wish maybe we didn't have at that point. It goes back to, again, that question. If you never start to look to change the future, you're going to keep repeating the present, which becomes more drag in the future when you do perhaps reach the point you want to change.
I think, yeah, this discussion has spurred me. What's kind of up here on the screen, what are the sort of pros and cons of a restructured market or wholesale competition market versus a regulated utility? And David, you're suggesting, what I think is probably close enough true, that maybe it's easier to manage a monopoly or utility, including its power generation, in the sense that they think about what they would want, or the utility would think about what types of generator it would want, and it would think about how to do this and then execute on that plan. Although it would be arguably it's a slow plan, or it changes very slowly. And as Fred says, you get dependent. You're like, I just built this nuclear power plant. I am now not going to do anything that makes me not build this nuclear power plant,
Or use it.
or build something else that would prevent me from using it when it comes operational. So that's in some sense, the con of the regulated utility, is it moves even slower. The markets is the exact opposite. It can move more quickly. But by definition, in some sense, that means some people who invested in something aren't going to make their money back, and they just don't exactly know who it's going to be yet. And they compete for not being them, whoever the investor was in the wholesale market. Is this kind of how do you think of the pros and cons of the regulated utility? I was at a conference this summer in Chicago, and the organizer of the conference was very pro-utility and thought monopoly type structures and thought, well, we've been providing reliable, low-cost service. That's the way they've been doing it from the beginning, and we can still do it. And he was kind of mostly, I think, mad at things like Enron and messing around in energy markets too much. And I was in agreement with that perspective, but I thought you didn't have to go all the way to that extreme to throw away the market baby with the bathwater.
I think the good utilities are good and the bad utilities are bad.
That's it.
No, I mean, it is hard because there are perverse incentives in the traditional utility model, and particularly in parts of the country, traditional utilities have been an obstacle to building cheap renewables, and so people often sort of pair the idea of a traditional utility with a lack of progress or as, sort of inhibiting a transition to a greener energy mix. On the other hand, you have Vermont, for example, which is a very green state that still has traditional regulation, the only one in New England, and they've gone green. They've gone green faster than a lot of the rest of New England. The rest of New England has trouble building green generation, except offshore. They're starting to get, it's away from people, no NIMBY problems there. You build it offshore. And so it depends on, it's hard to say, give a one-size-fits-all answer to whether a market or a traditional system is better, I think.
I mean, there's a reason, I didn't realize this growing up as a kid when I would play Monopoly, why the utilities on the Monopoly board are so valuable. Because they were monopolies, the water utility, the railroads, remember Monopoly board?
Oh, yeah,
Those
I know
were on the four sides, the
They got four
utilities,
sources.
and once you owned the utility, they were just money makers.
Maybe was that incentive there? Like you're surrounded by utilities. Is that the thing that they wanted to, you can't get away from utilities. You're surrounded by jail and utilities.
And I mean, even I gave the analogy of, opting out of the social contract of an electric utility. We've still got the water utility. We've still got the sewer utility. I mean, there's a reason those things were built and developed as a social good and what they enabled us to do and other countries to do by doing it that way. I'm just of the mindset just because you've always done something a certain way doesn't mean you always should, because the world does change. Technology does change. We do move forward, but the longer you do it, the more you build that and make that the system, then the harder it is to move away from it at some given point.
That may be happening in California with the new building standards, and maybe your vision there might be.
Now again, I disagree
borne
with
out.
what California's doing and the way in which they're doing it, but philosophically, I think there's a better way to do what they're doing and moving towards that. And again, your good utilities, bad utilities. I lived in Florida for many years when I was in the Navy, and now looking back at Florida, it's like, I can't believe Florida doesn't have the highest solar penetration in the world residential, yet they don't. They have one of the lowest, and there's one reason. FP&L.
Yeah.
So utilities don't like solar unless they're building it at utility scale and getting their guaranteed return on investment. Then they love it.
Isn't NextEra an FP&L company that they went out to the rest of the world?
Or
and
they
built?
go outside of Florida to build and penetrate other people's markets.
Irony.
Right? Yes. Well, I don't know if it's irony or that's the way their business situation is set up, and they're finding the pathway through there to maximize stakeholder value. So no, I guess, real consensus. I think the social contract question here, how much is a social contract a question going forward? David, do you think, I'm kind of thinking that markets are trying to, I made this statement earlier, I posed this hypothesis, that more markets enable potentially more breaking of the social contract, not an enhancement of it. At least if it's individual investment decisions.
I don't
If you
know.
include CO2 into a market, then that's an externality that everybody experiences. So maybe it depends on the thing you include in the market.
I don't know if that follows necessarily. I mean, obviously, shareholders bear the risk of failure and change here in Texas, right? So for generators, not for the wires companies, but for generators, right? So that insulates ratepayers from the kind of thing that happened in Georgia and South Carolina, right? And so if your utility-based rates or your grid-based rates are low, perhaps that keeps you loyal to the grid. I don't know. And then if you look at a company like Xcel, which operates in traditional markets both in Minnesota and Colorado and other places, they're insulated from that kind of competitive pressure, but their failure to provide enough renewable power started leading cities to want to form their own municipal utilities, get off the system, and only after Xcel promised to radically change their generation mix did those efforts to municipalize die. So, people have a way of imposing pressure even outside of a market, right? So again, I hate to give this wishy-washy answer that depends on the situation, but I feel like it does.
Well, I mean, it's embedded in the name of the social contract. If society changes their mind on what society wants in that contract, society can change that contract. It's not easy, it may not be pretty, it may not be inexpensive, but society can change the contract.
I guess that's a question, how we
Remember,
change it,
I
or who we vote.
went to the policy
Who we
school. I
vote
gotta
for,
say
yeah,
this
yeah.
stuff.
I mean, 100% of eligible voters don't even vote for the president, so, you know, our society choosing our elected officials is, but
Let me just say one before we leave that thought. Yeah. So this, our theme here is talking past each other, and I think a lot of people who aren't sort of knee-deep in this stuff the way we are here at the University of Texas get a narrative in their, say, news feed, which, you know, they partly shape themselves by what they click on, and the algorithm responds to that, and they partly, their friends click on the same thing. And these are all different sort of filter bubbles, as it's called in the literature, and you get these sort of much purer views of things. A market is good is always good, or we have to go 100% renewable right now, or we'll fall off a
have
cliff.
socialism in this country.
Or socialism is bad, or whatever. There's all these sort of purist narratives that arise in the digital world when we get our news from that source, that I think are helping people form much firmer and sort of straightforward beliefs quicker, and hardening those beliefs in ways that make my answer seem wishy-washy when it probably would seem normal to an average sort of electricity geek.
we're hoping, that's a little bit of the goal here. So if we,
Seeming normal?
or trying to be,
Yeah.
normal and I don't know, not trying to divide people on issues. Is there, try to ask a simple question of the social contract, do 100% of the people need to pay for something associated with, let's just say the electric grid for simplicity, or the energy system in general? It doesn't have to be 100% of the cost, but like transmission. 100% of the people should pay for whatever transmission exists, because that's the thing that literally connects people across distances and potentially social spectra, economic demographics. Or is that the definition? What would be the definition of the social contract? I'm just posing that as a potential definition.
That's
100% of the people have to pay for something.
That's not the legal definition.
Because I'm an engineer, I don't have to act like I don't know the legal definition. So you can go with the legal definition and.
Well, under the Federal Power Act, you're supposed to pay for what the parts of the system that benefit you.
Right.
And but you raise an interesting point, which is that, you know, the more interconnected that the grid is, and remember, it was balkanized originally, right, before we restructured. So now there's a lot more long-distance bulk transfers of power. And there are some parts of that system that really probably everybody within a very large geographic area benefits from, because it provides reliability and it brings good, clean power that displaces dirty power, that it influences that everybody benefits from. And so that's an issue that we talk about in my class, and that's becoming sort of a litigated issue now, which is the sort of people that advocate what you just said, that there are parts of the system that everybody ought to pay for. And we certainly do that in Texas, but with our transmission, or at least with the CREZ lines, and arguably we ought to be doing it everywhere.
I guess the origins and the sort of origins of the electric industry and what you just said, was that the case? I mean, you're in a monopoly territory. The 100% of the customers in that territory pay for 100% of the assets in there,
Yes.
as well as money to investors outside of the area.
Right, they did that. They did, yes.
So would it be safe to say we have gone some fraction away from that? Or maybe that's not true. I don't, what do you,
Yeah, that's
if
probably right.
If that's 100%. And
Or
it's
at least
happening.
figuring out who pays for what is a lot more difficult.
You need some more work for that. Yeah.
A couple questions.
You can see a question. Yeah, go ahead.
My question about something kind of talked about a while ago, so apologies for going back. But my question is sort of as a naive engineer as well. What is the role of regulators in sort of, you were talking about regulated utilities and talking about the utility side of things and how the utilities, you know, are acting as sort of mini monopolies and doing things like that. But what is the role of regulators in mandating green technology? Should they take a larger role? Do they have that jurisdiction? Do they have jurisdiction to make to force utilities to do time of price or time of use pricing if they want that? What is like an ideal role for a regulator in the clean energy transition? Like, I don't know, just to make that as effective as possible.
Probably, Dave, sorry, let me throw something out. Say regulator maybe versus elected official, and what the difference may be for addressing the same question.
So public utility commissions, which have the most direct authority over utilities, typically it varies by state, but the basic statute that authorizes them to act historically didn't have much to do with environmental issues at all. So it would take legislative amendments to that or additional legislation to sort of authorize or force them to do things, and that has happened in some states. But your last part of your question, which was anything having to do with rates, is squarely within their jurisdiction. So they have the authority to mandate time of use rates or any of that stuff. Any of the sort of any definition of the economic relationship between customers and utilities is squarely within their mandate. But historically, we've tended to think of that as excluding pure pursuit of environmental issues, absent additional legislation.
How would we? So the question is, why is it incumbent on utilities to enforce time of use pricing rather than regulators?
I just said I would like them to, but
Yeah.
I don't know that it's incumbent on them. I just, I think it has a lot of, the experiments indicate that it has a lot of positive benefits. It's sort of a win-win kind of a thing, which is why at least seems worth trying to me.
I would think there would be a business case for an individual rep, retail electric provider, to offer a true time of use rate, because that rep is buying from the market and selling at a flat rate to their customers. And if they can get customers to adjust their behavior through an incentive, they can adjust, influence what they're paying on the wholesale market. Now, they're not going to give you the full incentive, they want to skim a little bit off the top of that. But sure, I mean, that's the way a market works. So I don't see why a rep couldn't come up with a business model, probably not as simple as free nights and weekends or free weekends, but some kind of response to market prices to where if I influence my behavior based on that price signal, they can save money on what they're having to provide to everybody else and pass some of that savings to me as the incentive. I think there's enough margin, enough headway in there with current IT technology to enable it to do that. Maybe it's too complicated or complex for somebody to really stand up and do it. Or maybe some have in some regions and we just haven't seen it here in ERCOT yet.
On the sort of regulator and elected official sort of idea of working together on things, I guess the competitive renewable energy zones in Texas are maybe a good example of that. People want to build wind turbines, the transmission lines aren't there, the PUC says, we could sort of help people build transmission, but this doesn't seem perhaps within the exact mandate. Legislature, would you please weigh in on this? Legislature says, sure, we're Texas and we like stuff and people want to build stuff, so yes, administer the plan to build these transmission lines. Is that kind of a usual handshake? PUC says, people are asking this, but I can't do it. Legislature, you decide. They're sort of prodding, I guess, elected officials. Do you want to address this question versus just being silent?
Yeah, legislatures push them all the time. So my very first job as a law student was with a group called the North Carolina Alternative Energy Corporation, which the state of North Carolina forced the utilities to fund. It was in the heyday of PURPA. And it was about research into alternative, which was a euphemism for renewables and efficient energy generation. And the utilities, I'm sure they weren't thrilled to fund it, but they were forced to because that was an issue the legislature cared about. And I'm not going to say what year, but it was a long time ago.
Right. Is there a question?
But as a result of that, doesn't North Carolina, somewhat illogically perhaps, have some of the highest solar PV penetration of any state? I mean, I would not guess North Carolina to have the level they have compared to other states. It's pretty high, so I assume that was a direct result of it.
It could be. I mean, they pay a high rate under PURPA for it, to PURPA qualifying facilities for solar, which is why they have so much, I think. And it could be I bet there is a line somewhere between that effort and the current state.
Yeah.
You giving yourself credit for that? Or
Okay. I was a student intern.
Come on, hey, don't sell yourself short. Yeah.
Okay. So what would be the future prospective job growth as far as for going to green energies for like shutting down like major power plants and going to pretty much an autonomous like green energy such as solar and wind energy?
People don't realize that all these jobs are construction jobs, and that a typical solar, wind, and even hydro plant now operates remotely and automatically from a control room. On the other hand, there might be so much construction that's going to happen for so long, maybe, those numbers will stay large for a long time. But if the point of your question is that it's not the same as a union job in a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant, I think that's a point well taken.
So it sort of gets me to the next topic here, which is a broad topic, and we will not get all the way through. Altites, can't live with you, can't live without you. Sorry, I got the last two are sort of breaking up questions. We could also phrase this, give me chastity and continence from fossil fuels, but not yet, right? So this is the question going on out there. Do you want a Green New Deal or the same Brown deal? Or how long can you stay with one or versus the other? In some sense, there's two equations that seem incompatible to solve them simultaneously, if I were to pull out my engineering geek on there. So there's a climate equation. This is how much carbon emissions we can emit for a certain anticipated temperature change and climate impacts. A sort of equation of that directly related to combustion of fossil fuels. And then there's the, well, how fast do you want to transform the grid, or how fast can you go? And the sort of Green New Deal talking about, well, it's green and it's New Deal, so there's a lot of things that are the New Deal part, and it's the energy part that's the green part in terms of going low carbon, but it's talking about 10 years, and people have thrown out all kinds of numbers of 10 or 30 or 50 years, and because of the lack of action on actual carbon emission reductions, the time period gets shorter and shorter to meet some constraint equation on the carbon part. So I'm just throwing out that these equations sort of don't mix, that perhaps, I'll throw out like in some sense you can't meet both of these constraints. You can't transform the energy system without some sort of potential economic feedback during the time frame, which is independent of whether it's okay, right? So somebody say, I want to meet this climate constraint so bad, I'm going to get rid of some legacy fossil infrastructure that will not go through its full lifetime, and therefore the investors will not get their money back, and maybe we compensate them, maybe we don't. And I'm saying, somebody could say, well, that's okay, because I think this longer term goal is worth it. It's okay to go through some economic downturn in the process. Now, I'm saying that, but most of the analysis say there is no economic downturn associated with the transformation, and that's a larger question. But I don't know, so that's how I think about it a little bit. I don't know, Fred.
I agree with your summary there, and I think it really comes down to the classic tragedy of the commons. I mean, during my lifetime, I'm really old, David's almost perhaps not quite as old as me, I saw us stop polluting the land. I remember give a hoot, don't pollute. I remember putting trash bags on the window crank in the car door. You don't have those anymore, kids. There used to be a crank, you had to roll the window up and down. We stopped polluting the way we used to do it. Part of it was through shaming. You know, the crying Indian, as you saw, you remember those commercials? But you could see that. We don't see air pollution to a great extent. We certainly don't see CO2 pollution in the air. So I just don't know how you solve that problem. I really don't know how you get around the tragedy of the commons effect to where we are commonly in the U.S. and globally polluting the atmosphere in a way we don't immediately see and don't immediately feel the impact of, but over a very slow and long time. So it's a rate issue. I mean, as I look at it right now, looking at the CO2 numbers, the world is changing. And the world is going to continue to change because we haven't even much slowed our emissions, let alone reversed them. And we're ahead of most of the rest of the world when you go to China and other countries. So CO2 content's going up no matter how much effect we take immediately. So I don't want to say things like adaptation and evolution, but it's a reality. But how do you move the peg? How do you get people to start changing their behavior when they don't feel the immediate impact of their behavior? And that, I think, is what is fundamentally different about this pollution problem as opposed to other pollution problems, whether it was land pollution, water pollution, that we have addressed in the past. I don't know how you get your arms around this one. I need somebody a whole lot smarter than me to figure this one out, because I can't.
There we go. I won't claim
So
that we
Dave.
have two of those people up here, but no.
So maybe, maybe if people start to draw connections between the changing conditions and the extreme weather events and that sort of thing, perhaps that will create the same kind of groundswell we saw in the 60s and 70s. On the positive side, utility scale renewables are just really cheap, so there should be there is market pressure already to get to them. If we had a system that allowed us to easily permit the transmission lines outside of Texas that would allow us to get wind and solar that's cheap to market, I think that would greatly accelerate the grid transformation if we're still relying on a grid. And perhaps your technology is an answer if we can find a way to suck carbon out of the atmosphere as well.
Well, we know how to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, plant a tree.
Yeah, right.
Well,
And
yeah,
that's
the
the
rate.
simplest technology, and the rate is the number of trees. But I agree
Can I
with
just say
you.
one more thing about this equation here? And I don't know if it's the same as one you're seeing here.
Yeah.
I wish we did not frame the climate problem as in terms of a threshold or falling off a cliff in 12 years, because all progress, I mean, it's all lack of progress is worse, and all progress is better, right? So it's obviously a continuum, and I guess people know that conceptually, but the way the debate gets framed, it's all about hitting some target.
Yeah.
And you know, the faster we go and the more we go, the better we are, and the less we do, the worse we are. And
Along those lines, it's a phrase that I think is thrown out there, or something similar to what I'm about to say is, yeah, we need to change, we need to reduce carbon emissions, but the near future, the foreseeable future will still continue the use of oil and gas or something. So I think that's sometimes, I'll throw this out to either one of you, I see this as sometimes people saying, I understand your problem, I'm sympathetic with you, but I'm not going to change yet, right? And this is sort of give me chastity, but not quite yet. I need fossil fuels. It could be an argument that there are parts of the world that don't have the living standards of Western Europeans or Americans, and who are you to tell them that they can't do what we did? Right. And you could go that argument or not, and then the other argument on the renewable side is, sure, they don't have to do what we did. They can go renewables now. It's a whole.
And it's cheaper.
That's a large.
Some parts, at
that's
least
a large
parts of the
question.
system, it's cheaper, right?
So I see that as somehow, my initial phrase is somehow skirting the question and making it sound like you're sympathetic, but actually sort of avoiding the core problem, which is that there seems to be a conflict. Fred? I don't know if-
I mean, you're saying, if for those of you that are familiar with the Breakthrough Institute, that's sort of their mantra, right? Which is that letting the rest of the world modernize is going to require, in particular, nuclear power, or something other than just renewables. And if you want a really extreme version of that mantra, you can take the guy that split off from the Breakthrough Institute, Michael Schnellenberger. He's formed his own institute, which includes not only a pro-nuclear attitude, but renewables are bad. So he's gone that far in some of his latest missives. But I think that, I'm sympathetic to that idea that we can't tell people they can't advance their societies and grow to prosperity. So the question is, how do we help them do it in a way that's least destructive?
Right.
Well, it's not just a breakthrough. ClearPath has the similar approach, kind of an all of above, let's do it all approach to lowering emissions and working legislation towards that end. So there's a lot out there. I mean, I think one of the dynamics we all need to realize, we keep focusing on the greens and the renewables, i.e. the electricity sector. I believe in this country now, transportation has higher emissions than our electricity sector. I don't see a lot of people trading in the F-250s. At least not here in Texas. In fact, I'm about to go buy one. So it is hard. It is hard.
Is that a way to phrase the question? It's the transportation sector. It's not me. It's the transportation sector.
Well, it's the
or
transportation
it's
sector,
people.
but if you say, okay, well, I'll go buy electric cars, now it's back to the electric sector. I mean, you're just going to move it now. It's a move in the right direction, obviously, but it takes both then. And it takes both in
Is it
concert.
people or is it the sector? I guess is
Oh,
my
it's the
question.
people.
Okay.
It's people. It's humans.
Maybe we can have some concluding thoughts here. But on your concept of waste, people talking about or shaming and waste and trash and cleaning up the environment. I would say sort of the air capture community, the community of researchers working on how to take carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. This is sort of the framing of the problem, right, that they give. I've seen talks and met Klaus Lackner, and it's a waste. You're throwing it away. You wouldn't just let me throw trash on your lawn and let it sit there. Why not? This is the same concept, and we agreed not to do that, so let's just do that. You pay for your waste, you pay for the trash collector to come to your house, and I pay the city of Austin to take it away and go to a dump, and they're trying to minimize that. Well, why are we not paying for this, quote-unquote, waste, or CO2 in the atmosphere, which we seem to require? Do you think that's a proper shaming kind of thing?
I
or
absolutely
to-do?
agree, yeah. Carbon tax, plain and simple.
Yeah. Well, it's not
Absolutely.
yet led to it,
I'll
but you think
vote for
that's a viable route to try to get people
But
to
that's
accept
just three of us.
the tax? It seems like
We're not in the
viable route.
majority, as Josh noted earlier.
Right. Okay, I guess we'll maybe go with one last question. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I just wanted to throw out 3 words I think are important to the conversation. I'm so glad you ended where you did because, I'm a very big fan of carbon pricing. But fear, fairness, and truth. Those are important parts of relationships and change. And, we act out of fear and we don't necessarily agree what the truth is. And we want to feel like we were treated fairly when it's all said and done. And at every point I had some comment on one of those elements, and like we were talking about the reliability. So that's fear. And again, fear almost comes out throughout that. And so we're fearing change with the advent of renewables. We're fearing a loss of reliability. But if you actually look back through it, you'll see a turbine, you'll see pictures of turbines blowing up occasionally. But even that, the worst case event, doesn't do anything to a grid. That's considered a blip in the thing. So that goes back to that granularity that is actually a benefit. And if you look at actual incidents, if you catalog all the bad things that have happened in Texas over the last 10 years, usually it's a weather-related event that really impacted your big traditional generators. So we feared this change, we feared these new things, but if you catalog actual events, it's a tree fall on a power line. It's a small frozen water pump. So the turbine blows up, it's spectacular, it makes the internet, causes a great deal of fear, but it's the frozen water pump in a power plant somewhere that brings the entire plant down and actually causes the brownouts. So there was an element like that in every discussion where we didn't examine our fear against reality. We didn't agree on the truth to proceed in discussion.
Interesting framing. Should we be framing it that way? I've thought that exists interesting, I don't know, maybe it is fear. It's not necessarily from failure of nuclear power in the recent Japanese case of Fukushima, but just the concept of Godzilla, right? The concept of Godzilla originated from after World War II, and he's a radiation, he comes from the sea, and he spreads destruction across the country. But it's morphed. There's many Godzilla movies now, and now Godzilla has connotations of the nuclear power industry, and it's it can represent social feelings about fears of, in this sense, actually how their electric system operates. And I think the latest movie I read, which I haven't seen, is he's got his generator, he's got to recharge back up, and he's
Godzilla?
Yeah, and he's got he's a reactor core. He has and that's how you defeat him, I guess. You get him to melt down in his reactor core. But this is I don't know. What do you think about fear and truth? If we broke down any given narrative about energy and you said, well, here's what it's trying to make you afraid of, here's the truth it's avoiding or discussing, and here's how it can be made more fair, or here's how it relates to fairness. Maybe interesting.
We just did a study of opposition to energy infrastructure by NGOs. And one of the interesting things is that if you're particularly a local NGO that wants to stop anything, and this ran the gamut from fossil fuel infrastructure to wind and solar and even smart meters, fear is the logical way to go if you want to try to stop something. And there are fear appeals in all those settings. And I think your point's well taken that when it comes to reliability, and particularly the administration has sort of implied that traditionally dispatchable resources don't have the same kind of reliability issues associated with them when in fact they do, right? The soaked coal pile in Houston during the hurricane, or I think you were referencing in Texas the 50 or 100 power plants that went out, the gas plants because of the freeze. So they all have it. What I was referring to with the all renewables grid was that there are longer periods of time when we know from just data that the wind isn't blowing and it's at night, right? So we have to deal with that question of how to fill in that gap. And that maybe that we didn't really talk much about that today, but there may be lots of clean ways to do that, right? Building additional sort of generation plus batteries or some form of storage.
But that's a great example. We state that as a fear. Once you say that phrase, we haven't gone back to that timescale chart that says, when is this fear manifest? And the answer to that is, not for a long time, because
every
it's not
10
producing
years
at night.
or something, yeah.
Well, and it's producing at night when our demand is lowest also. So it's almost inconsequential. And really the only negative to it, if there is a negative, is it creates very low prices at night. So is that very low prices, is that a problem? Or is that a benefit to the consumer who likes to stay up late and do do is wash
Well,
again.
I mean,
we
I
go to
don't want to leave the impression that there is, that all renewables grid without storage is the same as a traditional grid without
Oh, I'm
storage.
not claiming it's not, but
Yeah.
see, again, you state it, it's like, oh gosh, that's some immediate fear. And the reality is, oh, okay, so if we continue building at our current pace, it's a problem in about a decade. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not
I
an
wasn't,
immediate
I hope I
problem.
wasn't trying to sound a fear alarm, but
But people react to a negative,
yeah.
just
it's a
your time
risk.
sense. Even if
People
there's
are
no-
hypersensitive to risk, yeah, I think that's right.
hypersensitive to risk. So even if you don't state a time period, it's like, oh, this is something to be afraid of. It's a near-time consequence.
When Fred was saying his little scenarios about 30 minutes out and stuff, I'm thinking, I grew up in Rochester, New York, right, where in December, the sun shone like 6% of the time that it was up one year, right? So, and it was cold and snowy and everything, and, you know, so people there might have a different sense of how, the risk factor, the fear of an additional increment of risk, even if that increment is small, might loom larger to them than it ought to.
Well, and it's a
Market signal to
misallocation
migrate,
of
though.
assets, because if we're really worried about some of these reliability fears, we wouldn't be having a discussion about the generation sector at all. It would be about how do we harden distribution, because that's where 9 out of 10 failures occur.
But you're making the point that fear comes from lack of knowledge or understanding or transparency. I mean, that is kind of the root of fear. So how do you chip away at the lack of knowledge, understanding, or transparency, i.e. education, to chip away at that fear?
Well, and in the end, we all came away saying that, well, probably on this slide in particular, pricing carbon tax is the clearest way to go. And to me, that's one of the best examples where the response to that is always fear. Oh, it's going to cause economic destruction. But there's almost no credible economic study where it says that is the likely outcome. They almost always say that it's like neutral-ish, maybe minus 2% of GDP, or in the same study, plus 10%. I mean, that's always kind of the error bars, and they're always typically neutral to positive in the final analysis. And that's the truth. That's our best understanding.
That's the analysis from the economic assessments. Since we haven't done it, there is no truth about what it costs, I would say. There's economic analysis and counterfactuals of arguments. And
You had a question, ma'am?
We'll have to wrap up. I will say something on the storage part and the grid before you ask your question, that I like to discuss, or I like to phrase that what we're trying to do in the grid is actually move away from 100% storage, not we're trying to have some storage in the grid, right? It's the nuclear fuel rod storage, the water behind the dam, the coal pile, the gas packed in the gas lines. The grid is traditionally 100% storage of energy that then gets fed in on demand, and what we're trying to do is see how far we can go away from that with the sort of wind and solar, and how far you go away from that now then starts to depend upon if you want to manufacture, sort of, I don't know, technological storage like batteries. So in my mind, we're trying to figure out how far away from 100% storage we can get.
Yes.
We'll make this the last question.
When you use the expression, the all-renewable grid, are you talking about an AC grid with lots of nukes, or are you talking about an imaginary DC grid?
I think you used the phrase, but
I wasn't I was not advocating a DC grid, but in my world, energy policy world and environmental policy world, there are a lot of people who aspire to have a 100% wind, solar, and water powered grid.
There's not enough water in
yeah.
We know the answers.
I know, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying that that's the debate I have to be part of, or I am part of. And there are famous sort of studies that argue that that's possible, and famous studies that challenge that.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I think it's independent of.
So you're preaching
or
to the
grid.
choir with me, but I think there are people that believe that, and so that's what I was referring to.
And part of that is the nomenclature we use. And it would be nice if we could change the words. I would much rather hear a zero emissions
Yeah,
grid
me too.
than a 100% renewable grid, because those mean very different things. And what is it we're trying to achieve? Well, it depends on who you talk to. I like to think we're trying to minimize emissions. Others like to think, no, we're going to be green. And thinking that will also, in somehow, then minimize the emissions. And it's not the same thing.
All right. I think maybe we'll leave it there. Fred, David, thank you very much on this Valentine's Day.
Thank you for the audience.
I don't have higher animosity toward you. I appreciate you more now.
Thank
So
you all for hanging in.
I don't know about the fear relationship. I don't fear